we look at these Paris attacks, and it seems to me that we are quite possibly in the presence of a phase change in the internal dynamics of terrorism, just as over the time period of September, October, we began to see a change in the mechanics of the world process. And this, of course, has to do with the Russian presence in Syria, but also a series of other events, right? Faction fights here in Washington, the refugee crisis striking Europe, and many other things. But when it comes to terrorism, here is what I would recommend. The more or less automatic analytical concepts that have been in force for the past 15 or so years, in other words, since about 9/11, September 11th, 2001, I think some of those concepts are now obsolete. And I say this as probably the individual who's done more than any other to create these concepts and to spread them. I've got here a copy of the 5th edition of my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA. And if we look at chapter 2, and I think this is pretty similar in the other editions, that one is called The Theory and Practice of Synthetic Terrorism. And right there I tell you the original title for this chapter was The Theory and Practice of State-Sponsored False Flag Synthetic Terrorism. Call it synthetic terrorism for short. And I go on to say this terrorism is synthetic because it brings together the efforts of a number of disparate components: patsies, moles, professionals, media, and controllers. It is also synthetic in the sense that it is artificial. It does not grow up spontaneously out of despair, oppression, or anything of the kind, but it is rather the product of an effort of organization and direction in which factions of intelligence agencies and governments play the indispensable role. Now, that was 9/11. That was false flag, meaning that the world was told Osama bin Laden in a cave, and the 19 hijackers, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and Ramzi bin al-Shib, and Mohammed Atta, and Hani Hanjour, and Jarrah, and the rest of them. They did this. Well, of course, they couldn't do it. And the big effort, the big point was they lacked the physical capability to do it. It was out of the question. It was like Dallas with Lee Harvey Oswald and all those shots in so little time hitting President Kennedy. But at the same time, I always pointed out, Al-Qaeda exists, and they can blow up a supermarket or a bus. And, of course, if you get a lot of Al-Qaeda together, they can blow up a lot of buses and a lot of supermarkets, and they can take over a city or maybe even a region. The one thing that they could not do was to orchestrate 9/11. But now, have not things changed? I think they have. And I would point in particular to the testimony of General Lloyd Austin, the U.S. CENTCOM commander here in Washington around the middle of August, I guess it was, where poor General Austin was forced to admit that after $500 million of expenditure, the U.S. had been unable to field more than half a dozen moderate terrorists or moderate terrorist patsies in Syria. So it meant that the holdings of the U.S. in the patsy milieu had been radically reduced. And I think you have to interpret that broadly in the sense that what Austin was pointing to was a fact that the U.S. terrorist franchise, the CIA and Pentagon terrorist franchise, had been radically depleted. So now we get the Paris attacks. And here's what I would say. There were a lot of people who were calling this false flag before there was any flag. The flag goes up either when somebody claims it, or the media say it, or a government says it, or what have you. And a lot of people were already chanting false flag, before any of that had happened. So I think what this means is a conceptual abuse. And in particular, two terms, gladio and false flag, it seems to me are not relevant, or not very relevant to what happened here in Paris. So I would say it is certainly state-sponsored terrorism, ISIS is a state. It controls territory. It has armed forces. It has intelligence, maybe not agencies, but it has intelligence divisions. And their specialty is, of course, this kind of blind terrorism, right? This sort of indiscriminate killing. That is what they do. So they've now exported that to Paris and to other countries in general. But we'll go through it. It comes in the middle of a pattern. And you have to ask yourself, is ISIS a reasonable suspect for having put that bomb in Beirut the previous week that had killed 50 people? I think it is. We've now got the conclusion that after, I think, stubbornly and not wisely resisting the obvious, the Russian government has now also said that their airplane over the Sinai was brought down by a bomb placed by ISIS. And then, I mean, we have other ones, right? We have the attempt to attack that train from Belgium to France. We have any number of examples, but above all, now we have Paris. And it seems to me that the Paris attacks fit more or less in this pattern. Now, there is the lie-hop side of it, which I'd like to treat perhaps separately. But here's the idea. ISIS is in big trouble. Without understanding this, you may not understand what the motivation is for ISIS to do this kind of stuff. Remember, if we go back to, I guess it's Lucius Cassius Longinus Ravilla, the consul of the Roman Republic in 127 BC, this is the guy who said, cui prodest scelus is fecit, right? The one who benefits from the crime is the perpetrator, or I would say is the prime suspect. This is the famous cui bono analysis. I would say the cui bono is that ISIS is losing. They're on the ropes. They're a paper tiger whose myth of invincibility has been stripped away by the Kurds and by those gallant female Kurds, right? The lady Kurds have, I think, done yeoman service in showing that ISIS really is very vulnerable and very mundane and very incompetent when you really get down to it. Obviously, what else can they be? That an anti-human genocide cult simply does not have an attraction to large groups of people, right? To a bunch of marginal sociopaths, okay, but not to the middle class of a large country. It's impossible. So the cui bono is that ISIS is losing, and we can see specifically how damaging that is for them. And they need victories. They need glory. They need victories. They've got to reacquire that aura of invincibility. The Western media are eager to re-endow them with the aura of invincibility. So they need to attack foreign countries. They need spectacular attacks, and they also need bombastic threats. They need blood-curdling rhetoric that they're going to attack New York and Washington and Rome. I think we need to take all of that with a grain of salt. And we'll be back in just a minute here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Now, I am taking this opportunity to call your attention to a number of things. First of all, to the daily briefing of the Tax Wall Street Party. It's free. You can subscribe anytime. You can do this through tarpley.net. If you go to tarpley.net, you find the text of the daily briefing. Scroll down to the bottom. There's something you can click on, a bar. Click on the bar, and you give your email address, and you get the daily briefing then through email. And at the same time, I would also urge you to go to TWSP.us. This is actually the simplest way to do it, also from our point of view. TWSP.us, Tax Wall Street Party.us, which is the Tax Wall Street Party, and that there you get directly. You don't have to click on anything more. You're practically there as soon as you start. So that's the easier of the two. TWSP.us. Get the daily briefing. Now, this past week, because of this emergency, I taped a statement. It's about a 30-minute statement in English and in French. En français. Disponible en français. So that is a series of ideas about what had happened and what should be done, and these are largely what I'm summarizing right now. But this is a video with sound, of course. So it's a film, and it's my address to the French people and also to Americans. What are you going to do about this, right? Enough of the commentary. We need to know what to do, and I do know what to do. Close the ISIS supply corridor between Jarablus on the Euphrates and the area of Efren and Aleppo. Cut the ISIS supply line. Interdict it. Shut it down. No more traffic. No more oil. No more gasoline. No more ammunition. No more spare parts. No more food. No more fanatical recruits. And destroy ISIS. Destroy ISIS within 1 month. With this, you have solved the refugee crisis in Europe, at least tendentially, and you've also set up a situation where terrorism can be significantly exterminated compared to what it is right now. But now again, why did they do this? And what is the benefit? They need glory. They need victims. They need victories. They've got to show everybody how ferocious they are, that they're the biggest sociopaths of the lot. Now, the controlled media hide this fact, right? They say, oh, ISIS is expanding. If you look at these Republican presidential candidates, they're insane. As I'll tell you later, I would say this is the week where the Republican Party went from majority reactionary to majority fascist, and in which now the Nazis have more or less stuck their heads up, starting with Trump. Trump and his Nazi triumph of the will. We're sick of this stuff. It's despicable, un-American, and it's going to create a tremendous harvest of hate around the world. A lot of people are going to die because of the loudmouth rhetoric of these Republican scoundrel swine. So we'll get to that, though. But here's the idea. ISIS is losing. ISIS has been defeated in Sinjar by a combination of the Kurds and the U.S. Military aviation. The ISIS line of communications between Mosul, their largest city, and Raqqa, their capital, has been cut because Sinjar has been taken by the Kurds, and a 25-mile stretch of Highway 47 has been seized. So that's a big defeat. It essentially cuts the terrorist caliphate into two parts, right? Again, like taking Vicksburg, just as that cut the Confederacy into two parts. That's the role of Sinjar. We had that report from Thierry Masson last week, and our broadcast was just about the same time as the taping of it, at least, was just about the same time as the Paris terror events. We learned from Thierry that in this Aleppo-Palmyra area, the Russian airstrikes have killed lots of terrorists, and a lot of them have run away. Somehow the glories of martyrdom don't seem quite so attractive when they can come down on your head any time of day. Congratulations to the Russians. The Russians are still running a 10-to-1 superiority over the U.S. in combat sorties. And this week we saw something also highly interesting. We saw Russian long-range bombers clobbering Raqqa. So that's another defeat. In other words, the French have clobbered Raqqa. The Russians are doing so. The U.S., I think, has done a few sorties also, but not enough. So with the 10-to-1 sorties, Russia to the U.S. and these bombers coming in, we'd have to say that this is hurting. It's hitting ISIS quite hard, right? It's the point where quantity turns into quality. So again, in the Aleppo-Palmyra area, the terrorist forces, and this is some ISIS, I'm sure, but it's the Nusra and Free Syrian Army and so forth, who have been thoroughly bombed. Thierry's estimate from last week was that there will be a collapse of the entire terrorist rebel position there as the Syrian army moves in with Russian air cover. So anyway, we have a certain amount of convergence, right? If the U.S. and the Kurds take care of Sinjar, and the Russians and the Syrian Arab army take care of Aleppo, Palmyra, we don't want to forget Ramadi, which is under siege by the Iraqi army. So it is a kind of offensive that is coordinated, or at least it's emerging as coordinated by design or by coincidence. We also have that famous air base that had been under siege for 2 years, which has also been, the siege has been lifted by the Syrian army with the Russian Air Force backup. The U.S. has also killed the infamous butcher Jihadi John from Great Britain, one of their most famous leaders. So you put that all together, that is defeat. They're being defeated on all fronts. But, of course, the controlled media don't tell you that. And the reason that they have to lash out in this crude way is because they're being defeated on all fronts. So here's, I think, who we can say is behind this, right? The prime suspects and more. First of all, Saudi intelligence. Now here, there's a very clear track record, right? Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, you'll remember at the end of 2013, went to Moscow and actually threatened Putin. He said, look, if you don't stop supporting Assad and the Syrian government, then we're going to visit terrorism on you. So that was the threat. And then they did it to some extent. Remember, they blew up the Volgograd railway station, the Stalingrad railway station. So the Saudis are not afraid to attack a superpower with terrorism if they feel that their despicable interests are being challenged. And we'll take it from there in the next segment here on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Remember, subscribe to the Tax Wall Street Party Daily Briefing. You go to twsp.us. You can also go to tarpley.net. One way or the other, get subscription, be well informed, know what's going on. If you don't know that ISIS is being defeated with places like Sinjar, Aleppo, Palmyra, Raqqa, Ramadi, and so forth, then you don't know what's going on. You can't judge why they do what they do. Now, my argument is, I'm saying there has been a phase change in the control over this pool of jihadis in the Middle East, right? A lot of these people are the ones who fought in Libya against Gaddafi. They had, in that case, NATO air cover. They were then shipped by the U.S., by Ambassador Stevens, unfortunately, the late Ambassador Stevens, from Libya to Turkey. They were then introduced into northern Syria. Remember that the entire Syrian rebellion is overwhelmingly foreign in origin. Those are fighters from Chechnya, from Saudi Arabia, from Libya, from Algeria, Tunisia, all over. But they were shipped into Syria as a destabilization operation, a CIA secret army. There never was a peaceful phase. The shooting started back in the early 1980s, and it never stopped. So the idea of this halcyon moment when the heroes of democracy and heroines of democracy were in the streets, this is baloney. But now there's been a phase change. At the moment where Austin says, I can only get half a dozen people, then you know that something has changed in the control apparatus, right? The control mechanisms for terrorism have shifted. I would urge you to bear in mind the concept of the Frankenstein's monster. You create it, and it turns on you. This has happened numerous times. Most prominent example is Hitler. Hitler's seizure of power was, of course, financed by Prescott Bush of Brown Brothers Harriman, and I'm sure Montague Norman of the Bank of England, and Thatcher Brown of the Brown Shipley in London. So this was then stoked by the appeasement policies of France and Britain and support for Hitler from the United States, as we've just said. And at a certain time, Hitler cuts loose from his moorings, gets the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and then attacks all these countries in the West, right? Denmark, Norway, then Holland, Belgium, and then France. And at that point, they realized, oh, my God, our Frankenstein's monster has turned on this. Now, and maybe today it's not quite so radical, but at least there are large parts of ISIS that have now acquired a kind of relative autonomy, at least vis-a-vis the Western powers, right? The ISIS was the creation of General David Petraeus. It was the Anbar awakening. It was the Sunni awakening. This was done by bribery to get them to fight against the Shiites. But now I think the question of who controls whom has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. So Saudi Arabia has a tremendous record. They're the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world. Not Iran. Not Iran by a long shot. Forget about Iran. They don't even qualify. But the Saudis, yes, because they're the ones with this network of radical mosques, of apocalyptic preachers, and the constant urge to kill the infidels. And of course, the Saudis need to do this for political reasons. If you were a Dark Ages monarchy stuck in the middle of the 21st century, you would have to promote the worst barbarians, the worst enemies of civilization, and unleash them like a cloud of locusts against all of your neighbors and your enemies and so forth. And even if Bandar is no longer at the helm because of his health situation or other things, this is an indispensable component. And as I say, if they're willing to attack Russia, they're willing to attack. They're willing to do anything. And these are the ones who have been calling for the elimination of Assad, either by diplomacy or by military means. So they're also in the assassination business. Now, Turkey is a similar story. In Turkey, we have numerous public statements by officials of the Turkish government, of the Erdogan Davutoglu government, where they keep saying, we will not allow any power to control the totality of our southern border. They're talking about the Kurds. And in particular, if the Kurds or anybody else tries to close that 100-kilometer, 60-mile corridor between Jarablus on the Euphrates and this Aleppo, Efrin area, we will not ask anybody's permission. We will smash them. Now, that could include the U.S. Special Forces. It almost did at the end of July, as we knew. So that's a threat to the United States from Turkey. So Saudi and Turkey are not afraid to mix it up with a superpower, right? They're that crazy, but they're willing to do it. The other force that I would see at work is the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, and that's in particular Erdogan. Erdogan is sort of the personal union of a lot of these things. He's, of course, the president of Turkey. He's the head of the AK party. He's a big cheese in the Muslim Brotherhood, and he's got this is the neo-Ottoman insanity, the neo-Ottoman megalomania that infects Erdogan and Davutoglu in particular. They actually want to conquer a large part of northern Syria as a first step towards reconstituting the Ottoman Empire. Now, Ataturk knew that was suicide, but these people don't get it. So they're also this is it's a power that's looking. It's a revisionist power. They want to go back and revise the Treaty of Sèvres, 1919, part of the Peace of Paris. That's the treaty between the victorious Allies on the one hand and the then extinct Ottoman Empire on the other. Right? That's the peace to end all peace. That's the origin of this terrible ethnic chaos that you see. But you better keep those countries, because that's all you've got. Got to hang on to national governments. Any nation is an ally. Any state is an ally, except not the Islamic State, which is a very peculiar sort of entity. Now, there is, of course, as we have implacably documented, a faction in the Pentagon and the CIA who want to overthrow Assad at all costs. They're hostile to Russia. They're hostile to Iran. We have talked about General Allen, the now gone ISIS czar. It's actually very interesting. Allen was in power until October 23rd. And it was then just a couple of weeks later, on November 11th, that the U.S. finally mounted the long-awaited offensive against Sinjar. So Allen had to be out for that to happen. And we're glad that he is out. That's a precondition for any positive U.S. response. Now, I would also think about MI6, right? As we said, perhaps last week, there's something going on with Perfide Albion. And this has got to do with this parade of very important people, General Sisi of Egypt and Prime Minister Modi of India and the President of China. The British are up to something treacherous and dirty. And I think they say, well, the U.S. are collapsing. They say are. And we've got to fill the void. So we're gonna recreate a kind of a British led bloc, maybe a Sino-British bloc. And as I tried to point out last week, it's important because Mao Zedong got into power because of British support. He was always an admirer of their philosophical radicalism, John Stuart Mill and Bentham and the rest of them, right? So he's their creature, and the fact that he got into power was largely due to the British. So we'll continue on that in the next installment here of World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Once again, subscribe to the briefing of the Tax Wall Street Party. Go to tarpley.net or TWSP.US. That is the Tax Wall Street Party website. So who did it? We're now up to the CIA Pentagon faction that we've been fighting in particular this past summer. MI6, this is a larger scheme, I guess we can say, crackpot scheming to be sure, but the idea, again, that the British are attempting to give the Chinese an advantage against the dollar. This is not a humanitarian thing. This is not going to be good for a lot of people. Again, those who've been wailing the loudest about U.S. domination will be wailing out of the other side of their mouth when they feel the knout of Beijing, right? If you ever imagine working in a factory run by those guys, this doesn't look good. So the other one I would point out is when we say CIA MI6, we've got to say DGSE, right? DGSE. And we'll have to note the fact that it's the General Direction of External Services, right? Direction Générale des Services Extérieurs. So that's the French CIA equivalent, and this is factionalized. I would say it's got to be factionalized along the same lines you see going back to World War II, because these things are, they move very slowly. But specifically in France, you had La Synarchie. You had this group of pro-fascist bankers and industrialists at a very high level. And then you had their operative arm, La Cagoule, the hooded people, who were the sort of the more operative ones, right, who got their hands a bit dirtier. But those characters are still there. And I would say the common denominator of them, although this is harder to document, is this Grand Orient Freemasonry, Le Grand Orient, and we'll talk about that in connection to the French Interior Minister Cazeneuve and to one of his predecessors, Claude Guéant. Right, you remember that when we had the Mohammed Merah case, we talked about Claude Guéant. That was back in the spring of 2012. So again, this is state-sponsored terrorism, but I don't see a false flag. If the French government says ISIS did it, ISIS says ISIS did it, claiming credit. Now that's not conclusive, but at least that's something. And we do have this idea that the people in the concert hall, as they were doing their killing, were shouting, "We're killing you because you killed our confrères in Syria and Iraq." Right? The French had joined in on the bombing. So I think this is now more a form of irregular warfare between states. It's state-sponsored terrorism, and there will be, obviously, every attempt will be made to obfuscate and to hide what's going on. But fundamentally, we're back to terrorism as irregular warfare, Kitsonian maybe, but irregular warfare of one state or pseudo-state, the ISIS or Islamic State, Daesh, ISIL, Caliphate, so forth, against a well-established nation state, i.e. France. Dispensable role. Now, that was 9/11. That was false flag, meaning that the world was told Osama bin Laden in a cave, and the 19 hijackers, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and Ramzi bin al-Shib, and Mohammed Atta, and Hani Hanjour, and Jarrah, and the rest of them, they did this. Well, of course, they couldn't do it. And the big point was they lacked the physical capability to do it. It was out of the question. It was like Dallas with Lee Harvey Oswald and all those shots in so little time hitting President Kennedy. But at the same time, I always pointed out, Al-Qaeda exists, and they can blow up a supermarket or a bus. And, of course, if you get a lot of Al-Qaeda together, they can blow up a lot of buses and a lot of supermarkets, and they can take over a city or maybe even a region. The one thing that they could not do was to orchestrate 9/11. But now, have not things flag before there was any flag. The flag goes up either when somebody claims it, or the media say it, or a government says it, or what have you. And a lot of people were already chanting false flag, before any of that had happened. So I think what this means is a conceptual abuse. And in particular, two terms, gladio and false flag, it seems to me are not relevant, or not very relevant to what happened here in Paris. So I would say it is certainly state-sponsored terrorism. ISIS is a state. It controls territory. It has armed forces. It has intelligence, maybe not agencies, but it has intelligence divisions. And their specialty is, of course, this kind of blind terrorism, right? This sort of indiscriminate killing. That is what they do. So they've now exported that to Paris and to other countries. We look at these Paris attacks, and it seems to me that we are quite possibly in the presence of a phase change in the internal dynamics of terrorism, just as over the time period of September, October, we began to see a change in the mechanics of the world process. And this, of course, has to do with the Russian presence in Syria, but also a series of other events, right? Faction fights here in Washington, the refugee crisis striking Europe, and many other things. But when it comes to terrorism, here is what I would recommend. The more or less automatic analytical concepts that have been in force for the past 15 or so years, in other words, since about 9/11, September 11th, 2001, I think some of those concepts are now obsolete. And I say this as probably changed. I think they have. And I would point in particular to the testimony of General Lloyd Austin, the U.S. CENTCOM commander here in Washington around the middle of August, I guess it was, where poor General Austin was forced to admit that after $500 million of expenditure, the U.S. had been unable to field more than half a dozen moderate terrorists or moderate terrorist patsies in Syria. So it meant that the holdings of the U.S. in the patsy milieu had been radically reduced. And I think you have to interpret that broadly in the sense that what Austin was pointing to was a fact that the U.S. terrorist franchise, the CIA and Pentagon terrorist franchise, had been radically depleted. So now we get the Paris attacks. And here's what I would say. There were a lot of people who were calling this false flag. The individual who's done more than any other to create these concepts and to spread them. I've got here a copy of the 5th edition of my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA. And if we look at Chapter 2, and I think this is pretty similar in the other editions, That one is called The Theory and Practice of Synthetic Terrorism. And right there I tell you the original title for this chapter was The Theory and Practice of State-Sponsored False Flag Synthetic Terrorism. Call it synthetic terrorism for short. And I go on to say this terrorism is synthetic because it brings together the efforts of a number of disparate components: patsies, moles, professionals, media, and controllers. It is also synthetic in the sense that it is artificial. It does not grow up spontaneously out of despair or oppression or anything of the kind, but it is rather the product of an effort of organization and direction in which factions of intelligence agencies and governments play the indispensable